Okay, so this is chapter 6 in your personality theories textbook covering the research on the Neo-Freudians. All right, so first line of research, we're going to look a little bit into coping here. So coping strategies. And coping strategies are divided into active role coping strategies versus avoidance role coping strategies. And we'll talk about more of those here in just a second. And then with the active role strategies, we're talking about strategies that are directly aimed at the source of stress, right? So kind of attacking the source of the stress, or active strategies that are directed at emotion. And so coping, remember, has to do with efforts to reduce anxiety. All right, so these types of coping strategies, again, these are our first two are considered active strategies. So problem-focused strategies where you are directly attacking the problem, okay? So you're essentially kind of trying to solve the problem as a way to cope. With emotion-focused strategies, however, you're focusing more on the kind of emotional distress, right? So the emotions that are associated with the particular problem, and that is how you're trying to deal with that particular stressor. And then there's avoidance strategies. So with avoidance, you're basically trying not to think about the situation. You're trying to kind of push it into some kind of unconscious awareness, right? So trying not to think about it. You could think of this as akin to repression, right? As a Freudian defense mechanism. So with modern research, we know that oftentimes we use a combination of both emotion-focused and problem-focused coping strategies, and sometimes we also use avoidance strategies. So how effective are these strategies? So with the active strategies, again, these are the problem-focused and emotion-focused, that these tend to be more effective, right? Tend to be more helpful, whereas avoidance strategies are not overly helpful. So with avoidance, we might be looking at things like, for example, using substances, right? So using drugs to avoid maybe sleeping, to avoid procrastination, to avoid, and we know that those are not successful ways of dealing with anxiety, right, and of dealing with problems. They are not successful coping strategies. With the active strategies, basically, if we're looking at kind of what is better, emotion-focused or problem-focused, the research tells us that problem-focused approaches are best when the problem has some kind of solution. So when I can actually solve the problem or correct the problem, that a problem-focused approach is better, right? So actively trying to solve my problem is better. If, however, the problem does not have a solution, so let's say, for example, you have found out that someone in your family has a terminal illness. There is no solution, right? There is no way to solve that particular problem. This person is going to die, right, from this particular illness. And so the emotion focus tends to be better when we have problems that do not have an easy solution. So emotion focused is better for those kinds of problems. In looking at coping strategies, though, we need to also demonstrate some degree of what's called coping flexibility. So coping flexibility is basically adjusting your coping to fit the particular situation. So it would not be advantageous to use problem-focused coping in every single situation, no matter what, because again, some problems are not solvable, and so it just wouldn't make sense. So coping flexibility basically means that when we can adjust, right, when we can flexibly apply our coping strategy, then we tend to be able to deal more effectively. And research also shows that people who have coping flexibility have a higher sense of well-being, and they have fewer emotional problems compared to people who are more rigid in their approach to coping. All right, so let's talk a little bit here about aggression. So psychoanalytic concepts look at the role of aggression, and one of these hypotheses that we can potentially test is something called the frustration aggression hypothesis. So this is the idea that when people are allowed to vent their aggression, right, so when they're allowed to express their aggression, that they can basically experience some kind of catharsis or this release of psychic energy, and that will actually reduce aggression in the long term. Okay, so allowing people to vent aggression will reduce aggression in the long term. So testing this particular theory, we can see that there is maybe not so much research, right, to support that particular frustration aggression hypothesis. So if we look at the displacement of aggression, right, so looking back at these Freudian defense mechanisms, we can take that aggression, right, and instead of directing it perhaps at the target that we really want to, oftentimes, again, we direct it at a safer target, right, or an innocent target. And then typically what happens is that aggression is displaced, and then we overreact, right, to something that is a very minor offense, right, or a small or minor annoyance within that innocent target. So someone does something to bother you, and then the reaction is way out of proportion, right, to what it actually should be. So there is a decent amount of research that indicates that aggression actually does not lead to this reduction in the showing of aggression, that allowing people to vent aggression does not actually lead to a reduction in aggression. In fact, research indicates that acting aggressively often actually increases the tendency to aggress. So first, it leads to a disinhibition, right? So once we violate the rule that it's not okay to physically hurt people, it's easier, right, for us to go on once that rule is violated. Additionally, aggressive cues in the environment, when we see something that's associated with violence, it increases aggression, and it taps into the emotions, right, or the memories that we have that are related to violence. And the idea here also is that the cathartic release of tension feels good, right? So venting those aggressive impulses actually feels good, and then it leads to some kind of reinforcement of this particular behavior. So not a lot of support for this frustration aggression hypothesis. All right, let's look at object relations theory here also. So object relations theory is basically looking at the relationship that a child has to a significant other, and that significant other is the object. Typically speaking, we're talking here about attachment relationships between parents and children. And from this attachment relationship, the child develops what's called an internal working model. So an internal working model is basically the kind of understanding that the child has for how relationships should go, right? So what do relationships with other people look like based on that first relationship that the child has with the primary caregiver? So within object relations theory, we can look at the types of attachment. So this is based on the work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, if you guys remember those from child development courses. And they propose that attachment is comprised of two different constructs. So you guys can see here the fear of abandonment at the top, and then the fear of closeness on the side. So the fear of abandonment are basically these internalized feelings of self-worth, and you can have a high or a low degree of those. And then the fear of closeness is basically how much comfort does the person have in having close relationships with other people? How much can you depend on others? How much can you trust other people? And you can have high or low degrees of those. So then based on these two dimensions, we can come up with these four types of attachment. So secure attachment, that you have a low fear of abandonment and a low fear of closeness. And this is the most common type of attachment, and we'll look at some outcomes for this here in just a minute. With the avoidant or dismissing, we have a low fear of abandonment and a high fear of closeness. So for the avoidant, we typically have children who have a relationship that's characterized by the parent kind of not being very responsive to the child. The child responds to the parent with a kind of aloofness, right? That the child is maybe a little bit emotionally detached, as is the parent, and maybe not super interested in engaging with the parent. Then on the other end, we have anxious ambivalent, sometimes also called preoccupied, where we have a high fear of abandonment, low fear of closeness. So with anxious ambivalent, the child becomes very anxious when separated from a caregiver. This is likely a result of the child being abandoned at some point, right? So a caregiver who really was not there for the child at some point. And so essentially the child thinks like, well, when you leave me, even if it's for a short time, you're probably not going to return. And so when the caregiver actually does return, the child oftentimes is very angry at the caregiver. It's almost like, well, you left me and I didn't know if you were actually going to come back, and so I'm upset with you now. And then the last one here, high fear of abandonment, high fear of closeness. This is disoriented, fearful, sometimes also called the disorganized pattern of attachment. And these children are typically seen as the least securely attached, and this is the most problematic because they don't really show any predictable pattern the way that the other three do. So there is really no predictable pattern here with the disoriented, fearful children. All right, so if you have wondered perhaps about, how we might measure attachment in adulthood, so object relations theorists have developed what's called this adult attachment scale. And so you guys can look here at some of the items that are on this particular scale. So when there's an AV afterwards, that's for the avoidant type of attachment, the S is for secure, and the AX is for anxious. So you guys can get an idea about some of the behaviors at least from this attachment perspective, that adults may be showing based on those particular typologies. All right, so in looking at the long term and kind of looking at the historical impact, so what did these children experience as they're recalling kind of what their childhood environment was like. So for secure adults, they typically talk about having a home environment where the parents were very warm, the parents were very nurturing, and they trusted their parents, right? So had a pretty solid parent-child relationship. With the anxious and ambivalent children, they oftentimes said that there was very, very little parental support, right? So parents really did not support them. And then for avoidant, that their relationships with their parents were kind of very distant, right? So very detached, very distrustful. And then looking at how could this impact adulthood. So much of the interest with attachment styles in adulthood looks at how would this function in close relationships or romantic relationships in adulthood. So you guys can see here that with the secure attachment style early in life, that there are a number of positive outcomes. And again, tying this back to that internal working model. So these children have learned, right, as children, that people will be there for me, right? They won't abandon me, and that I can trust other people, right? That other people will provide for me. And so that shows up then in the specific behaviors that they're doing in their adult relationships. With the avoidant type, their adult relationships are likely to have problems with intimacy, problems with jealousy, rarely describing themselves as kind of in love, right? So they have a very difficult time kind of forming that particular relationship with other people. With the anxious attachment style, they're oftentimes very, very afraid that they're going to lose their partner. So oftentimes they'll just kind of give in to whatever the partner wants. And they are kind of very dependent, right? That they really rely very, very heavily on a romantic partner, and they're very unlikely to break up with a partner, even if the partner does not meet their needs. Now, keeping this in mind, that attachment research shows us that although you may have had these attachment relationships early in life, it is not deterministic, meaning that your early attachment relationship does not necessarily dictate what your attachment style will be in romantic relationships in adulthood. So there is research that shows that adults can actually change their attachment style, provided that they enter into a secure adult relationship. So there is hope, right? You can actually change.